The winter of 1886 had teeth. It bit hard at the edge of the Colorado Territory, near where the Wyoming wind came screaming down from the high plains. Snow swirled in the air, stinging eyes, clinging to the old wooden stalls of Ridgewood's trading post. Those stalls leaned like tired drunks, their boards groaning under the weight of frost. The smell was a mix of smoke, wet leather, and that sour edge of bad whiskey and desperation. Men bargained over cattle, over saddles, and sometimes over lives. A dog barked once, sharp, before curling into itself under a wagon. Elias Kane stood apart from it all, boots sunk into the frozen dirt, coat collar turned high. His hat brim threw a shadow over eyes that had seen too many winters and too few reasons to stay. He'd ridden 2 days for a horse, nothing more, not for company, not for warmth, and sure as hell not for love. Then he heard it. A voice soft enough to be lost in the wind, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Can you buy us, mister?" He looked down. She couldn't have been more than 6, this little scrap of a girl. Cheeks smudged, hair tangled into wind-blown knots. Her dress was thin as paper against the cold, and in her arms she held a bundled baby, eyes blinking slow against the snowflakes. She clutched him tight, her fingers trembling. "What did you say?" Elias asked, his voice low, graveled from long miles on the trail. The girl lifted her chin, brave in a way no child should have to be, and pointed. My mama." Elias followed her finger. Up on a rough wooden platform stood a woman, wrists shackled in iron. Her head hung low, hair spilling forward in dark tangles. A shawl, worn thin, hung from her shoulders. She didn't cry out, didn't plead. She only reached one bound hand toward the little girl in the dirt. The auctioneer's voice rang out over the wind. "Next lot, fit for cooking or cleaning. Comes with 2 dependents. Starting bid, $10. Somebody laughed. Another man spat into the snow. "I'll pay $5 just to get her off the block." Elias felt his jaw tighten. His boots moved before his mind caught up. "15, he said flat and cold. The auctioneer blinked, then smirked. "15 I've got." "35, Elias cut in. The crowd fell silent. The gavel came down hard. "Sold." The little girl's grip on the baby didn't ease, but her eyes, those big, guarded eyes, lifted to him with something dangerously close to hope. The girl's words echoed inside Elias Kane's head as he stepped forward to claim his purchase. Coins clinked in his palm, their cold weight nothing compared to the storm that had just torn open inside him. The auctioneer's glance slid from the silver to the revolver on Elias's hip, and whatever joke he'd been about to make died in his throat. The gavel strike had been final, but this, taking them from that platform, felt heavier than any deal he'd ever made. Chains fell from the woman's wrists with a sharp clink, a sound so clean and cruel it cut through the wind. The girl, Rosie he'd learned later, tightened her arms around the bundled infant and stepped forward without hesitation. The woman, her mama, moved slower, her boots dragging through the snow. She didn't look up. Elias said nothing, not until they were far enough from the trading post that the shouts of cattlemen and clink of bottles faded into the hiss of wind through pine. "Ma'am," he said at last, his voice steady though his breath showed white in the air. "I need to see your face." She stopped. The wind tugged strands of dark hair across her cheek. Slowly, with the kind of care you give to an old wound, she lifted her head. The world dropped out from under him. Her eyes, blue, wide and haunted, were a memory he had buried in fire and smoke. Bruises shadowed her cheekbones, the edges fading like the last embers of a dying fire. "May?" His voice was a raw scrape. The name had not left his lips in 5 winters, but here it was, alive again, tasting of ash and hope. Her lips parted, trembling, her knees buckled. Elias caught her, his hands gripping her arms just long enough to keep her from the snow. He could feel the thinness of her frame, the sharpness of bone where there should have been softness. The little girl moved between them, clutching the baby as though she could stand between her mama and whatever danger this man might be. They walked the rest of the way in silence. Snowflakes spun in the air like ash from a cold fire. Ridgewood disappeared behind them, replaced by the quiet of the narrow trail to his cabin. The place stood alone on the ridge, boards weather-worn and roof lines sagging, a structure built to keep a man alive through lonely winters and little else. Elias had always thought it felt too big for one man. Now, as May crossed the threshold, it felt almost too small. He stoked the fire, laid out blankets near the stove. May's hands moved without being told, unwrapping the baby, folding Rosie's coat with careful precision, tucking both children close to the heat. Elias watched her from the shadows near the door. It was her, no question. And yet, questions roared in his mind. The night of the fire in Kansas had been a wound he never thought would close. The boarding house gone in minutes, her room swallowed by flames, the landlord swearing no one made it out from the second floor. He'd searched until the sheriff told him to stop, then searched more until winter itself shut the trail down. After that, there'd been nothing left but the photograph, her in summer light, laughing, and the lantern he lit each night, a ritual against forgetting. And now, here she was, with a little girl who had her chin and his eyes. He poured water into a tin cup and set it by her elbow. She murmured a thanks without looking at him. Rosie sat on the floor near the stove, the baby cradled in her lap like a secret. Elias felt the years stretch between them like open country. 5 winters, 5 springs, time enough to build new lives or lose them entirely. Whatever road she'd walked, it had been crueler than the cold outside. He could see it in her shoulders, in the way her eyes kept tracking the door. He wanted to ask everything at once. Where had she been? Who had done this to her? Why had she not sent word? But the fire popped and hissed, and the words froze in his mouth. Some answers he knew couldn't be taken. They had to be given. So he stepped back, giving her space, but not distance. And for the first time in 5 years, Elias Kane felt the shape of something unfamiliar pressing against his ribs. It might have been hope. The fire in the stove had burned down to a steady orange glow. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, low sighs. Elias sat at the edge of the table, hat set crown down beside him, watching the flicker of lamplight on the woman who had once been May Whitlock. She was quieter than he remembered. Back then, her laughter could run a whole summer afternoon. Now, her words were rationed like winter grain. Most of what she said was to the children, soft reassurances, little instructions, never to him. Rosie kept close to her mama's skirts, stealing quick looks at Elias when she thought he wasn't watching. The baby, Jonah, slept mostly, his tiny hands twitching as if chasing something in dreams. Elias wasn't a man given to staring, but tonight he couldn't stop. He traced the line of May's jaw, the slope of her shoulders, comparing them to memory. The woman in front of him was shaped by hunger, hard travel, and fear. But she was still the woman he'd once planned to marry. When Rosie coughed, May knelt beside her, pressing a hand to the girl's forehead. Elias noticed the gesture, gentle, practiced, but his eyes snagged on something else. As Rosie turned her head, a lock of hair shifted, revealing the soft skin just beneath her left earlobe. There, plain as the North Star on a clear night, was a small dark freckle. He knew that mark. He had one just like it. Same size, same place. The memory came unbidden, his mother's voice saying it was a family stamp, a thing passed down without choice. He'd seen it in an uncle, in a cousin back in Missouri. He'd never thought about it much, until now. Elias's hand tightened around the edge of the table. He leaned back, forcing his breath even. There was no sense in spooking the girl, or her mother, before he knew the truth. May must have felt his eyes, because she glanced up. For 1 second, their gazes locked. Something moved there, recognition maybe. But then it was gone, shuttered behind her quiet mask. She rose and busied herself with folding a blanket, as if that fleeting moment hadn't just happened. The cabin was small enough that silence carried. It wrapped around them like another layer of the winter outside. Elias could hear the tick of the stove cooling, the slow draw and exhale of the baby's breath, the creak of the floor as May shifted her weight. He wanted to demand answers, now, tonight. But the trail had taught him patience. You didn't catch a skittish horse by running at it with both arms wide. So he let the moment pass. When the children were tucked into the small bed in the back room, May lingered by the doorframe, her hand on the latch as if the cold beyond tempted her more than the heat within. Elias stayed seated, hat brim hiding his eyes. "You've been gone a long time," he said finally, his voice low. May didn't answer. She looked down, thumb tracing the grain of the wood beneath her hand. "Long enough that I buried you," Elias added. "Long enough that I stopped riding out on the anniversaries, because there was nowhere left to ride to." May's shoulders shifted, just slightly, but she still didn't speak. Elias stood then, slow and deliberate, closing the space between them until he was near enough to see the tired lines at the corners of her eyes. "I ain't asking for the whole trail tonight," he said. "But I need to know if I'm looking at the same woman who said yes to me 5 years ago." Her eyes lifted just enough to meet his, and in them was something brittle, like glass that had been through fire. "That woman's gone," she said softly. Elias swallowed whatever words had been building. He nodded once, a slow, almost imperceptible dip of the chin, and stepped back. "Then, you and the young ones take the bed," he said. "I'll keep the fire." He settled into the chair by the stove as May closed the door behind her. For a long time, he just stared into the coals, the freckle under Rosie's ear burning in his mind like a brand. It began in the deep hours of the night, when the cabin was wrapped in the kind of silence only heavy snow can bring. Elias had dozed in the chair by the stove, head bent forward, hat tilted low. The fire was steady, throwing a circle of orange light that barely reached the corners of the room. The sound came soft at first, just a restless shift of blankets in the small back room. Then a cough, thin and dry, followed by another. Elias lifted his head. A door creaked open, and Rosie appeared in the faint light, her bare feet pale against the wooden floor. She swayed a little, and in her arms, Jonah stirred and whimpered. "May!" Elias called toward the back room. May was already on her feet, her hair unbound, moving quickly to take Jonah from Rosie's arms. She pressed the back of her hand to her daughter's forehead and inhaled sharply. "She's burning," May said, voice tight. Elias was moving before she finished speaking. He poured water into a tin bowl, dropped in a handful of dried willow bark from the shelf above the stove, and reached for a clean cloth. "Sit her by the fire," he said. May obeyed without question, lowering Rosie into the chair he had just vacated. The girl's cheeks were flushed, her eyes glassy, breath coming in short little pulls. "Don't you drift on me, girl," Elias muttered as he wrung out the cloth and laid it across Rosie's forehead. The heat coming off her was alarming. Heat that didn't belong to a healthy child in winter. May knelt beside her, one hand smoothing Rosie's damp hair back, the other holding Jonah close to her chest. She didn't look at Elias, but he saw the way her jaw clenched, the way she kept her body between him and the children, as if she still didn't know which way he might turn. He didn't take it personal. Not yet. Hours passed in slow inches. Elias fetched water, added wood to the stove, kept the cloth cool. May coaxed sips of the willow bark brew into Rosie's mouth. Jonah, as if sensing the tension, stayed quiet in May's arms. Elias couldn't help himself. He studied Rosie in every still moment. Her face was thinner than a child's ought to be. The skin stretched over cheekbones that hinted at too many lean months. But it was the small, familiar things that gripped him. The stubborn set of her mouth when she resisted the bitter tea, the faint crease between her brows. Then it happened. May shifted Rosie's head to adjust the cloth, and a strand of hair slipped, baring the soft skin beneath her left earlobe. That freckle. Dark. Small. Exactly where his own was. Elias felt the air leave him. The fire's warmth turned to something else entirely in his chest, a thundering certainty. That was no chance, no accident of birth. It was blood, his blood. The rest of the night blurred. The fever eased toward dawn, Rosie's breathing evening out into a light snore. May slumped forward, resting her head against the arm of the chair, Jonah finally asleep in her lap. Elias stood over them, the truth pounding in his skull until it forced its way out. "That mark," he said quietly. May's eyes opened slowly, as if dragging themselves from the depths. "Is she mine?" For a long moment, May didn't answer. The only sounds were the crackle of the stove and the faint sigh of the wind outside. Then May's lips pressed together, and she gave the smallest of nods. "Yes," she whispered. The word landed like a bullet and a blessing all at once. Elias stepped back, running a hand down his face, letting the years spool backward in his mind. The summer they'd planned their wedding, the letter he never got to send, the night he'd ridden into Kansas, too late to find anything but cinders. "Why didn't I know?" His voice wasn't anger, but it was heavy enough to make the air between them feel colder. May straightened, shifting Jonah to her shoulder. Her eyes met his, steady now, stripped of the earlier evasions. "Because I wasn't allowed to tell you. The fire wasn't an accident, Elias. It was set to cover the fact that I'd been taken. They didn't just burn the boarding house. They burned every letter I'd written, every trace I'd been there. And when I found out I was carrying her..." She looked at Rosie, brushing her hair back gently. "They made sure you would never hear of it." Elias felt his hands curl into fists before he forced them open. "Who?" She didn't hesitate. "Barlow Creed, and the men he keeps. I was moved from place to place, made to work until my body gave out. Married off to a man who wanted a servant, not a wife. Rosie was born in that house. Jonah came after. The names, the places, they were already writing themselves into Elias's mind like a wanted poster. And when I heard Creed was in Ridgewood, looking to settle some debt by selling me and the children." She swallowed hard. "I thought it was the end. Until you stepped forward." Elias drew a slow breath, pulling the anger in tight like reins on a spooked horse. "You should have told me sooner," he said, but there was no bite in it. Only the ache of 5 lost years. May's gaze didn't waver. "You weren't meant to find us. Not unless you were ready to fight for more than just me." For a moment, neither of them moved. The light creeping in through the shutters was thin and gray, the kind of morning that promises more snow. Rosie stirred and sighed in her sleep, her small hand curling into the blanket. Elias reached down, smoothing her hair back, letting his fingers rest for just a second on that telltale mark. "She's mine," he said, more to himself than to May. May's voice softened. "And she knows you're someone worth trusting. She wouldn't have asked you to buy us otherwise." The words hung there, simple and final. Elias straightened, the decision forming before he even realized it. "Then Creed's not just your problem. He's mine." May didn't thank him, didn't smile. She just nodded, as if she'd known that truth from the moment she saw him on the edge of that market. The wind outside shifted, rattling the shutters. The day was coming, and with it, the next move. Elias Kane had spent 5 years walking with ghosts. Now he had something living, and he'd be damned if he let anyone take it away again. The day had the brittle light of midwinter, that pale, colorless sun that does little more than remind you what warmth used to feel like. Elias had been out back splitting kindling when he heard it, distant hoofbeats carrying across the snow-crusted ridge. They came steady, deliberate, the kind of pace men keep when they want you to hear them coming. May stepped onto the porch, Jonah in her arms, her shawl drawn tight. Rosie peeked out from behind her skirt, eyes darting toward the sound. Inside, Elias told them, not looking away from the tree line. May hesitated, but one look at his face was enough. She pulled the door shut behind her. The hoofbeats grew louder until 3 riders broke from the pines, their horses' breath fogging in the cold. 2 wore brown trail coats. The third, a broad man in a black duster and bowler hat, rode in the middle. He reined in first, boots crunching as he dismounted. Even before the man spoke, Elias knew. "Barlow Creed," he said flatly. Creed smiled without warmth. "You've heard of me." "I've heard enough." Creed stepped forward, gloves creaking as he pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I'm here on business, Kane. That woman you've got inside, May Whitlock, formerly May. Well, you know the rest. She and those 2 young'uns are property under a defaulted labor lien. I've got the papers to prove it." Elias took the document without hurry. The handwriting was slanted and fancy, but the seal was a smear of cheap ink, the kind you see on bar tabs and bad contracts. He read it through once, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his coat. "Bogus," he said. Creed's smile tightened. "What you're doing is called harboring stolen assets, Kane. I've already filed in 2 counties. You can hand her over now, or you can face trial." Elias's eyes narrowed, his voice turning to cold iron. "That's no asset. That's my family. And you're trespassing." The riders behind Creed shifted in their saddles. One reached down as if to adjust his stirrup, but Elias noted how close his hand came to the butt of his pistol. "You think you can protect them?" Creed asked, voice oily. "You think a man with no badge, no law, can hold off what's coming?" Elias took one slow step forward, then another. His coat shifted just enough to show the worn walnut grip of his revolver. "I buried one life 5 years ago. I've dug enough graves to know who belongs in the ground. You come back here for them, Creed. I won't aim for dirt." Creed's smile vanished. The air between them felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Too still, too charged. The standoff stretched. Then Creed gave a sharp whistle. The riders wheeled their horses. "You're making enemies with deeper pockets than you can count, Kane," Creed called as he swung into the saddle. "I've fought men with more gold," Elias said. None of them had Rosie's eyes. For a heartbeat, Creed's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The 3 of them rode off, snow kicking up behind them, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the trees. Elias stood there until the last echo was gone. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. The door creaked behind him. May stepped out, pale but calm, Jonah asleep in her arms. "Will they come back?" she asked. "Yes," Elias said, "but next time we won't answer alone." Later, as twilight bled across the snow, Elias sat by the fire cleaning his gun. May watched from the table, her hands busy mending a tear in Rosie's coat. There was no need for more words. The air between them had shifted. Rosie played quietly on the rug, arranging a row of wooden blocks, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. Jonah slept in a basket by the stove, tiny breaths puffing into the quilt. Elias looked around the cabin, at the soft light, the smell of stew still lingering, the creak of floorboards under small feet, and felt something he hadn't in years, a place worth defending. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the promise of trouble. But Elias Kane had made his choice. Trouble would find a different welcome here than it expected. If you were Elias Kane, facing Barlow Creed's threat, would you? 1. Stand your ground, no matter the cost. 2. Try to move May and the children to a safer town. The night after Creed's visit, sleep came slow to the Kane cabin. May sat at the table with a blank sheet of parchment in front of her, the lamplight turning her hair to copper and shadow. The pen in her hand trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what she was about to do. Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're sure?" May didn't look up. "He'll keep coming, not just for us. I've seen the others he's taken. If I stay quiet, I help him keep going." Elias stepped forward, resting one calloused hand on her shoulder. "Then we speak." She dipped the pen into the inkwell and began, her script slow but unshaking. To the office of the sheriff, County of Ridgewood. Line by line, she set her years in captivity into ink. The fire that was no accident, the forced marriage, the births of Rosie and Jonah, the false debts and forged papers. She named the houses, the men, the towns. The pen scratched on until the candle burned low. When it was done, Elias signed his name beneath hers, witness, protector, believer. He folded the letter, slid it into his coat, and said, "At first light." Morning brought a brittle chill, the kind that cracks ice in the water bucket. Elias hitched the wagon, helped May and the children up, and set the team toward Ridgewood. Snow crunched under the wheels, the road a white ribbon through the pines. Word travels fast in small towns. By the time they rolled into the square, a few curious faces had already turned their way. Inside the county hall, Sheriff Wyatt Boone stood at the front, arms folded, his mustache twitching as he took in May's pale but determined face. Elias stepped forward. "We request a public hearing for May Whitlock, declared dead but breathing, and not just breathing, with truth." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That a fact?" May stepped past Elias, holding Jonah close. Rosie clutched her skirt, her small fingers twisting the fabric. "My name is May Whitlock. 5 years ago, I was taken from a boarding house the night it burned. Barlow Creed arranged it. He faked my death with the help of a bribed landlord. I was pregnant when taken. I gave birth to Rosie in captivity. Jonah came later." A ripple moved through the room. Someone gasped. "He moved me from town to town," May continued. "When my second husband died, I was sold again. I was on that auction block when Elias Kane found me." The sheriff rubbed his jaw. "You got proof?" Elias laid the folded letter on the table. "Signed testimony, names, dates. You can follow the trail." Boone began to read. His eyes hardened as they moved over the words. Then a voice rose from the back. "I know one of these women." Heads turned. A tall woman with silver streaks in her dark braids stepped forward. "My sister worked at that house in Kansas. We thought she ran off. She wrote once, then vanished. I remember you." She pointed at May. "You helped her hide once." May blinked, recognition breaking through her composure. "Your sister? She got out?" The woman's voice caught. "Number not all the way." She turned to the sheriff. "She told me about men dragging May out the night of the fire. Said her room was empty before the flames reached it." A low murmur swept the crowd, angry, unsettled. Boone raised a hand. "Order." He looked at May. "You willing to sign this before a magistrate?" "Yes." He nodded to a deputy. "Put a federal wire out. I want Barlow Creed named and hunted. Full warrant." The deputy was gone in a rush of bootsteps. The sheriff looked back at May. "This makes you a target. You'll need protection." Elias stepped up beside her. "She's got it." By the time they stepped back into the cold square, the air around them felt different. Not safe, never that, but charged with a kind of momentum neither of them had known in years. They climbed into the wagon. Rosie leaned against May's side, wide-eyed from all the voices and stares. Jonah slept through it all, his small fist curled into May's shawl. As Elias took the reins, May glanced at him. "You believe this will matter?" Elias looked out at the snow-covered street. "It already does. Creed came here thinking we were alone. Now the whole damn town knows different." That night, Elias kept the rifle within arm's reach and the fire high. May moved about the cabin quieter than usual, but there was a different set to her shoulders, something that looked a lot like freedom taking root. Rosie sat at the table, drawing circles in the frost on the window pane. Jonah gurgled from his basket. The wind outside rattled the shutters, but it didn't sound like it was trying to get in. The warrant went out faster than Elias expected. Sheriff Boone's deputy wired it to the nearest federal office before the ink had dried. And by nightfall, Ridgewood Saloon was humming with talk of Barlow Creed's name hanging on the law board for all to see. But a warrant was just paper, and paper burned easy. Elias knew Creed wouldn't ride off into the hills and vanish. Men like him didn't disappear. They circled back, meaner for the trouble you'd caused. The next 3 days felt like the wind before a blizzard, still enough to make you wonder if the storm had changed its mind, but cold enough to keep you braced. May kept busy, which was her way of holding fear at bay. She mended Rosie's coat, cooked hearty meals, swept the porch clear of snow. In the evenings, she taught Rosie her letters by the fire, Jonah's soft gurgles filling the pauses. Elias watched all of it, silently marking every small sign that this cabin was no longer a place for just one man. On the fourth morning, he was tightening the saddle straps on his mare when Sheriff Boone rode up, snow dusting his shoulders. "Heard from my contact in Laramie," Boone said. "Creed's men have been seen on the trail south. Could be nothing. Could be him moving pieces." Elias adjusted the cinch one last time. "Either way, I'm not waiting for him to knock." Boone studied him for a moment. "Town split on you, Kane. Half think you're a fool for taking on Creed. The other half, well, they're starting to remember what it looks like when a man doesn't flinch." "I'm not asking for a parade," Elias said. "Just enough space to keep my family breathing." Boone's mouth twitched, maybe almost a smile. "Space I can give you. Luck you'll have to make yourself." That evening, the cabin felt tighter than usual. The fire popped in the stove, but the heat seemed to pool low, leaving the corners in shadow. May was quiet, her hands folded in her lap. "Say it," Elias told her. She shook her head. "You already know." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Say it anyway." May's eyes found his, steady. "They're coming." Elias nodded. "Then we make ready." They started small. Elias reinforced the shutters with extra planks, oiled the hinges on the doors so they wouldn't squeal. He checked the rifle, the revolver, the extra box of cartridges. "May door wedi a boilio, bara sistal I dod I ben, I didiaur withnos. A lenwide croc a stuber, dafod sin bosable I fuitan, reenwedel os bid angen." Rosie watched from the table, her small hand smoothing a folded scrap of cloth. "Mama, why are we making the windows thicker?" May smoothed Rosie's hair back. "To keep the wind out, sweetheart." Elias caught May's glance, an unspoken understanding that some truths had to wait. The first snow of the new storm came in the night, soft flakes whispering against the roof. By morning, the ridge was white to the tree line. Elias stood on the porch, with a mug of coffee gone cold, scanning the trail until the snow swallowed it whole. Boone's words kept replaying in his head. "Half the town thinks you're a fool." Maybe they were right. But the other half, the ones who'd nodded at him in the general store, who'd offered quiet words as he passed, those were the ones who mattered. Creed's kind of fear thrived on silence. Breaking it was always going to come with a price. The price came at sunset. Rosie was setting Jonah's cradle to rocking when the low sound of hoofbeats rolled through the snow-hushed air. May froze in the doorway. Elias crossed to the rifle by the wall. 4 riders this time, dark shapes moving slow along the ridge trail. The one in front wore a black duster. Elias didn't wait for them to close the distance. He stepped out into the yard, the rifle cradled in his arms, not raised but ready. Creed reined in 20 paces from the porch. "You've been busy, Kane," he called. "Sending wires, stirring folks up. You think that little sheet of paper changes what's mine?" Elias's voice carried clear over the wind. "Ain't yours. Never was." Creed's laugh was short and mean. "Paper burns. People burn faster." Elias took one step forward, boots crunching in the snow. "You won't get close enough to test that." The man to Creed's right shifted, the butt of his rifle catching the dying light. Elias's finger tightened on the trigger just enough for the message to be clear. Creed's eyes narrowed. "You'd shoot in front of your woman and your brats?" Elias's jaw clenched. "I'd shoot to keep them from seeing worse." The air between them felt like stretched wire. One wrong move and it would snap. From the porch, May's voice cut through. "Barlow Creed!" Every head turned. May stood there, Jonah in her arms, Rosie pressed to her side. "I'm not hiding anymore," she said. "The sheriff knows, the town knows. Run as far as you like, the law will follow." Creed's smile was gone. "You think the law scares me?" May didn't flinch. "Number. But it scares the men you pay to do your work, and without them, you're just another coward with a gun." The rider on Creed's left shifted uneasily. The one on the right looked away. Elias saw it, the first crack in Creed's armor. Fear, not of him, but of the ground shifting under his boots. Creed spat into the snow. "This isn't over." Elias raised the rifle just enough to settle the sight on the space between Creed's boots. "I hope not. Gives me something to look forward to." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Creed jerked his reins, turning his horse toward the trail. The others followed, their shapes vanishing into the dark. When the last hoofbeat was gone, Elias lowered the rifle. May stepped off the porch and stood beside him. "They'll come back," she said. "Yes," Elias replied. "And next time, we won't be the only ones waiting." Later, after the children were asleep, Elias sat by the fire cleaning his rifle. May sat across from him, the lamplight catching the lines of fatigue and resolve on her face. "You meant that?" she asked. "About not being alone?" Elias looked up. "Creed came here thinking we were just a man and a woman on a ridge. Now he knows better. And before he rides back, the rest of his men will know it too." May leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire soak into her bones. "What if they come at night?" "Then we light the lamps and make the night theirs to fear." Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet as breath. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Barlow Creed was already plotting his return. But inside the cabin, there was no more talk of running. The line had been drawn, and both Elias Kane and May Whitlock were standing on the same side of it. Spring didn't arrive so much as it softened the edges of winter. The ridge thawed in size, drip lines from the eaves, black soil showing through the tired snow, the creek talking again like it had something hopeful to say. For 3 weeks, no sign of Creed, only rumors riding the mail stage, and a new wanted bill fading in the sun on the saloon wall. Paper still burned easy, but this one had a dozen sets of eyes to remember what was on it. Elias cut new fence slats under a sky the color of a clean tin cup. May aired blankets beneath a breeze that smelled of wet cedar. Rosie chased the flight of a bluebird with the solemn focus of a student, and Jonah discovered his own laugh. Sudden, bell-clear, a sound that clattered the last pieces of winter in Elias's chest. On a morning when the frost held but didn't bite, May found Elias by the woodpile, sleeves rolled, shirt damp at the neck. He looked up, the way a man does when the sound he hears is the one he's wanted most. She didn't say his name. She only held out a length of prairie grass she'd braided, while the coffee boiled and tilted her head toward the hill that carried the wind like a hymn. Whispering Hill. The place where long ago, on a warm evening, two younger people had talked like the world would listen. They went on foot, letting the ground wake under their steps. The town had heard. Ridgewood had a way of knowing the business that mattered. And so a small knot of folks trailed at a respectful distance. Widow Merle with her shawl and soft eyes. The storekeep's boy who had shown Elias the new cartridges. Two ranch hands who had stood on the porch the night Creed first came and said nothing but did not leave. Sheriff Boone walked last, hat in hand, not a lawman today so much as a witness. Rosie went ahead barefoot, as if she trusted the earth to remember her, clutching a bouquet of wild mustard and creekside lavender she'd yanked up roots and all. May carried Jonah against her, his head in the crook of her elbow, his fingers worrying the edge of her shawl. The wind laid the grass down in long strokes, and somewhere a hawk wrote circles into the bright. At the rise, the town peeled away to the side, a half-moon of faces that knew the difference between watching and intruding. Elias stopped at the crown of the hill, where the view spilled north to the dark line of pines and south to the long, new green sweep of pasture. He took Jonah from May with the easy competence that comes from repeating the same miracle every morning, then handed the boy to Rosie with a wink that said, "You're bigger than you think." May stood before him in a simple dress she'd mended twice and washed until it knew the shape of her. Her hair was unbound, dark as river silt, and the last of the winter's pallor had left her face. The bruises had gone to memory. The set of her jaw had not softened, only settled into a strength that looked like peace. Elias didn't pull out a ring. He reached into his breast pocket and brought forth a coil of prairie grass, the ends tucked in the way a man tucks in a shirt before a Sunday meal. He held it between his palms, as if it were both sacred and plain. "Not a vow for show," he said, voice level but carrying. "No altar, no choir, just this, a promise made where the wind can hear and the dirt can keep it. I am yours, May Whitlock. All of me, the parts that got left in winter and the parts that learned to thaw." May's mouth trembled into the smallest smile. She took the braid with both hands, turning it like a new thought in the light. "I was yours when the world called me dead," she answered. "I was yours when my name didn't fit, when the doors locked and the windows wouldn't open. If a life is a trail, Elias Kane, every turn I didn't choose still led me back here." He wrapped the grass around both their wrists, practical as a lariat, reverent as a prayer. The knot wasn't fancy. It held. Rosie slipped between them and touched the braid with a finger like she was learning a letter. "This time," she said, "chin up the way small generals hold it. We all stay." Laughter shook the little half-moon of onlookers, soft, surprised, clean. Sheriff Boone stepped forward, not with a badge, but with an old rancher's plain benediction. "May you have more water than fire," he said, gruff as a fence post, which in this country might be the finest blessing a man could give. Widow Merle dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief that had been through more funerals than weddings, and looked grateful to tip the count the other way. Elias drew May to him. The kiss wasn't long. It was a seal, like pressing a brand into fresh pine. Not to scar, but to say this belongs. Jonah yawned at that precise moment, a punctuation mark written by a god with a sense of timing. They did not rush back down the hill. They lingered the way people do after a storm has passed, and the sky learns it's bright again. Rosie made crowns of clumsy daisies and forced them on Sheriff Boone, who endured it like a man taking fire for a cause. The ranch hands argued about whether the calves would come early on account of the mild thaw. Widow Merle told May in a voice only for her that the schoolroom needed a steady hand if a certain woman had the half mind to try. The storekeep's boy solemnly presented Elias with a single cartridge, bright as a coin, as if to say one more should you need it, and may you never. When they finally turned toward the cabin, Elias took the long way, skirting the edge of pasture where the new fence ran true. He had gone out the night before with a lantern and hung 2 frames above the mantel, a daguerreotype of his parents whose faces looked like the country itself, tired and stubborn, and the summer portrait of May, the one that had carried him through 5 winters. He hadn't told her. Gifts mattered most when they were found in the ordinary light of a coming evening. Back at the cabin, Rosie rushed through the door and stopped, hand to her mouth. "Mama," she whispered, pointing. May followed the finger and saw the photographs set side by side, not like museum exhibits, but like neighbors. Elias watched her face, watched it flicker from surprise to recognition, to something he did not dare name until she turned and rested her forehead against his chest for one single, unguarded heartbeat. On the bureau in the small room that had become theirs, he'd left a wooden box lined with faded felt. Inside lay a ring that had nearly become legend, never given, never thrown away. May found it as the kettle began to sing. She did not call out. She did not slide it on. She wrapped it in a scrap of linen and tucked it in the top drawer with the shirts she meant to mend. A secret made of ordinary things. A promise with patience. The evening stretched slow and generous. May cooked in quiet rhythm, the skillet announcing each turn of cornbread, like old friends coming up the walk. Elias set plates with the solemnity he gave to loading a rifle. Jonah kicked air from the cradle, issuing happy threats to the ceiling. Rosie returned to her serious business of drawing letters in the fogged window. The one she wrote best that night was a K, crooked and proud. When darkness settled, Elias stepped out to the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, steam ghosting into the blue. May joined him, shoulder against his. Down in the hollow, the creek bragged about all the places it had to go. A coyote called twice and then thought better of it. "They'll talk," May said after a while, not afraid of the fact, just naming it. "They already are," Elias answered. "Most talk's useful. The rest dies before it crosses the ridge." She turned the empty mug in her hands. "And creed?" Elias breathed the night in deep. "A vow don't stop a man like that, but it makes the ground you stand on worth fighting for." May nodded, accepting an answer that held exactly as much certainty as the country allowed. "Then we've chosen our ground." He reached for her hand and found it, the lines of their palms meeting like a map finally matching the road. "We have." Inside, the fire ticked down to coals. Rosie, not yet surrendered to sleep, padded out with something held to her chest. She climbed into Elias's lap and unfolded a little booklet stitched from scrap. 3 figures on horseback, drawn with the grave artistry of a 6-year-old. One tall, one with hair like a river, one small with pigtails flying like flags. Underneath, in letters marching brave and awkward, it said, "We found the home you lost." Elias's throat went tight in the way that keeps a man honest. He kissed the top of her head, and May watched that simple act as if it were a sunrise no one else had noticed. They put the children to bed with the window cracked just enough to let the creek's voice in and the night's teeth out. On the table, May left the prairie braid like a centerpiece, green still, not ready yet to dry and crack. "I used to think love was a thing that happened once," she said when the lamps were low. "And if it got burned, that was the end of it." Elias looked at the braid, then at her. "Maybe it is once. Maybe the once just takes longer than folks expect. They didn't promise safety. They promised presence. In this country, that was the braver oath. Before he banked the fire, Elias checked the rifle by the door, not from fear, but from habit, the kind that kept a vow honest. He hung his hat on the peg above the photographs and paused, seeing in the glass the ghost of a younger man step aside to make room for the one standing there. When the last lamp went dark, Whispering Hill kept on whispering, but the house below it no longer sounded hollow. It carried new echoes, small feet on wood, soft laughter, the scrape of a chair as two people drew closer and stayed. The night laid itself over the ridge like a quilt stitched from second chances. Somewhere beyond the pines, Barlow Creed counted his men and measured his pride against the size of a town that had learned to watch. That chapter would come when it came. Tonight belonged to a vow wrapped in prairie grass and sealed with plain words. Tonight belonged to the quiet kind of courage that starts as a decision and turns into a life. And if the wind heard their promises and carried them down the valley, it also heard the older truth stitched inside. Not that nothing bad would happen, but that if it did, this time they would meet it side by side. The thaw had barely turned the pasture green when the first sign came, a smudge of dust on the far ridge, too steady to be wind. Elias saw it from the porch where he was fixing a hinge, the sound of Rosie's reading lesson floating from inside. 3 riders moved in the distance, slow, deliberate, like men who wanted to be seen. May stepped to the doorway. Her eyes followed his line to the ridge. "Creed?" Elias nodded. Inside, Rosie's voice stopped mid-word. "Mama?" May didn't look back. "Keep reading to your brother." Her voice was so even, it felt like a wall. Elias checked the rifle, calm hands, steady breath, then walked out to meet the dust. The riders halted at the fence line, where the new pine slats stood fresh against the old land. The lead man wasn't Creed. Too young, too polished, but his eyes had been trained by the same cruelty. "Mr. Kane," he called, tipping his hat like it was a blade. "Creed says you've got something that belongs to him. Hand over the woman and the young'uns, and he'll let you keep this place." Elias didn't raise his voice. "Tell Creed this. He comes for them. He comes for me. And I'm the kind of ground you can't buy." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. He wheeled his horse and left without another word. Dust followed them over the ridge, curling like a fuse not yet burned. That night, the saloon's back room filled with townsfolk. No whiskey on the tables, just black coffee and intent faces. Sheriff Boone leaned against the bar, listening more than speaking. May stood shoulder to shoulder with Elias. A rancher asked if she feared what was coming. "Fear isn't the question," she said. "The question is whether we meant what we said on Whispering Hill." By the end of the night, watch lines were set. The fastest riders would carry word. Those who couldn't fight would keep the children safe. Ridgewood was no longer just watching the Kanes. It was standing with them. 2 days later, strangers arrived. Dusty mules, faces thin, but eyes alive. A woman said they'd heard of a place where a name could stay yours. May brought water. Elias unlatched the gate. That evening, while the new guests rested, Elias and May sat on the porch. The creek's voice was louder now, swollen with meltwater. "They'll keep coming," Elias said. May's hand found his. "So will we." 3 life lessons from this story. Promises matter most when tested. Elias and May's vow on Whispering Hill only became real when Creed's men rode to their fence. Promises are easy in calm weather. True worth shows when the storm rolls in. A community can turn the tide. Ridgewood wasn't strong because of one rifle, but because the townsfolk chose to stand together, each in their own way. Riders for messages, elders for watch, mothers for care. Home is claimed, not given. The cabin was once just shelter. It became a home when Elias and May opened the gate to strangers, turning survival into belonging. That night they banked the fire and checked the doors. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. Inside, children breathed in their sleep. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Creed counted his men. Here, Elias and May counted something else, each heartbeat that meant they were still standing. Some vows are spoken once, others are kept every day. On this land, theirs was both.